NSFW, what is the most disturbing history fact you know? Great War, year 1915, in Polish fortress in Osawik, at that time under control of Russian Tsar, took place in Living Dead Counter-Strike. This was Germany's third assault on the fortress. This time they used gas that was a mix of chlorine and bromine, as they knew the Russians did not have proper protection. After the gas attack, Germans marched towards the fortress, but they did not expect the bayonet charge of burned, spitting blood and parts of their lungs Russians. The view surely was terrifying as 7,000 German soldiers fell back, driven away by 100 Russian survivors. As expected, the damage caused by gas was lethal. In 1237, Genghis Khan's third son, Ajidari, ordered the rape of 4,000 Weret girls above the age of 7 in front of their relatives. Afterwards, some were sent to the royal harem and others were turned into prostitutes. Probably something more disturbing, but this is the first thing that came to mind. The Germans collected the hair of the Jews, made it into insulation. There's probably some houses, buildings out there now that's still using Jewish hair from then to keep them warm. Edit found a bit more detail if anyone wants to read. JewishCurrents.org link. Belgian Congo. Everyone thinks Belgians are just knockoff French or Dutch, but those moffas did some brutal stuff when they colonized, like hacking off a limbs as punishment. Athanasios Diarchus, a Greek history hero, was impaled from his butthole through his mouth alive. Vlad the Impaler did that to a lot of people. It would take days for people to die, and he would sit and eat his food next to people while they suffered. It was so gruesome it even repelled an invading army. This is just for me. I love NSFW history facts. The ancient Egyptians believed that there was a single channel connecting between the female's mouth and her vagina, with the uterus right in the middle. If a woman wanted to know if she could get pregnant, she would shove a whole onion up her vagina and wait for a day. If her breath smelled like onions on the next day, would have meant that she couldn't get pregnant, because she has a puncture in her uterus, which is how the scent got past the uterus and made her breath smell like an onion. French medical mystery terror, the one most famously known for allegedly eating a baby, was autopsied after his death. The autopsy revealed that his gullet was so wide that when his mouth was opened, one could see directly into his stomach. His entire body was full of pus and his stomach filled most of the space in his abdominal cavity save for what was taken up by his abnormally large liver and gallbladder. The scent of his body was said to be fouler than rotting offal. Everything you need to know about the history of warfare is boiled down to a Walt Whitman quote. War is 999 parts diarrhea and 1 part glory. Statistically, most people in non-modern warfare were more likely to die shitting themselves to death than dying some glorious heroic death. After a major rebellion against the British Company rule in India, the Brits retaliated by strapping Indians to the front end of cannons and firing. A couple years later the Raj was founded. I can't think of a more punishment that blends cruelty and visibility any further. Blanche Monier was a French woman who was being kept prisoner in a small dark room by her own mother. She was kept there secluded for 25 years, and when the police discovered her, she was surrounded by filth. A photograph of her was taken shortly after she was discovered in her room, and the look in her face is haunting. That this experiment was allowed to happen. Case study. In the United States, 1944, an experiment was conducted on 40 newborn infants to determine whether individuals could thrive alone on basic physiological needs without affection. 20 newborn infants were housed in a special facility where they had caregivers who would go in to feed them, bathe them and change their diapers, but they would do nothing else. The caregivers had been instructed not to look at or touch the babies more than what was necessary, never communicating with them. All their physical needs were attended to scrupulously and the environment was kept sterile. None of the babies becoming ill. The experiment was halted after 4 months, by which time, at least half of the babies had died at that point. At least 2 more died even after being rescued and brought into a more natural familial environment. There was no physiological cause for the babies' deaths. They were all physically very healthy. Before each baby died, there was a period where they would stop verbalizing and trying to engage with their caregivers, generally stop moving. nor cry or even change expression. Death would follow shortly. The babies who had given up before being rescued died in the same manner, even though they had been removed from the experimental conditions. The conclusion was that nurturing is actually a very vital need in humans. Whilst this was taking place in a separate facility, the second group of 20 newborn infants were raised with all their basic physiological needs provided and the addition of affection from the caregivers. This time, however, the outcome was as expected. No deaths encountered. Source link. In my country, last military takeover the government, they used to throw random people that were just at the street from planes to the sea. After the Nazis' concentration camps were liberated, the gay prisoners were thrown in regular jail because homosexuality was still a crime in Germany. Kellogg created cornflakes so people would be too bored to masturbate. Seriously, he thought anything with flavor would cause excitement and make you masturbate. The cornflakes you eat now are sweeter than what they used to be. He also advised people to put carbolic acid on little girls' nether regions so they could never derive pleasure from masturbation sex, among other crazy things. He was nuts. Mary Turner, her husband was tortured and lynched by a mob of white folks looking for somebody else. When she spoke out against it, 9 months pregnant mind you, they beat her, hung her by her ankles, covered her in gasoline, set her on fire, and while she was still alive they gutted her like a pig and her screaming baby fell out of her torso. The crowd stomped it to death. This was 1918. It is believed during the 16th and 17th century, one way you can be punished for your crime is rat torture. What would happen is a person will be put laying down on a table with no shirts on with maybe 2 or 3 rats in a cage on your stomach. On top of the cage would be a bowl that would be filled with hot coal that would burn you and make it too hot for the rats. Due to being in a cage there was no way for the rats to escape the heat of the coal, so the rats would burrow into the person's stomach. Historians are unsure if this punishment was until the rats got to a certain depth or the death of the victim. Mao Zedong killed more people than Hitler and Stalin combined. Hitler killed 10 mil. Stalin killed 20 mil. Mao killed 45 mil. Heart monitors worn on the Challenger's space shuttle show that the crew wasn't killed instantly, but actually survived for a while. I like to think they weren't conscious for any of it, but they probably suffered horribly for some time. Let me tell you about a wonderful torture method called Scafism. In ancient Persia, a prisoner is force-fed honey and milk, while also coating their body with them, particularly to the genitals and the anus. They are then fastened naked on a hollow tree trunk, with only their face and limbs exposed, and placed on stagnant water. They then would proceed to piss and shit out all those sweets vouchsafed to them, at which point the bugs are attracted to them. These insects would proceed to sting, bite and tear through their skin and burrow in their anus as they lay there covered in urine and feces. And no, they cannot die from starvation nor dehydration, cause they'll continue feeding them until they succumb to infection. In the 1800s, a woman named Madame Marie Delphine Lalaurie did some really horrific things to slaves she owned at the time, including cutting off their genitals and sewing them shut in the mouths of still living victims and similar things. I think she only got found out when a cook intentionally set the house on fire hoping to kill everyone inside because death was better than what was happening to them inside that house. Edit. Corrected 1 letter. Anything from the reports of Unit 731. That's just pure evil, especially considering the people responsible were pardoned by the US. There is a Neolithic mass grave in Germany of 26 young children and men with a high number of injuries on their legs. They were intentionally crippled before they were killed by arrows and blunt force. The systematic and deliberate way the victims' lower bones were broken indicate torture. The group missing girls and women also means they were most likely abducted. Warfare 7,000 years ago. Shield Race. He was a nobleman and the commander of the French Royal Army. He was one of Joan of Arc's first and most ardent supporters. He fought beside her and was one of the heroes of the Siege of Orleans. He was promoted to a Marshal of France. He was also one of the richest men in France. In 1434-35 he retired and built the Chapel of the Holy Innocents. The chapel put on a passion play of his own writing. The play, called Le Mystère du Siège d'Orléans required 140 speaking parts, 500 extras, and consumed 600 costumes daily. Unlimited food and drink was made available to those attending the play. This ruined him. In the meantime he was capturing, sodomizing, and killing young children. The boy was pampered and dressed in better clothes than he had ever known. The evening began with a large meal and heavy drinking, particularly hippocras, which acted as a stimulant. The boy was then taken to an upper room to which only Gilles and his immediate circle were admitted. There he was confronted with the true nature of his situation. The shock thus produced on the boy was an initial source of pleasure for Gilles. He stripped the child naked and hung him with ropes from a hook to prevent him from crying out, then masturbated upon the child's belly or thighs. If the victim was a boy he would touch his genitals, particularly testicles and buttocks. Taking the victim down, Race comforted the child and assured him he only wanted to play with him. Race then either killed the child himself or had the child killed by his cousin Gilles de Sillé, a Poitou or another body servant called Henriette. The victims were killed by decapitation, cutting off their throats, dismemberment, or breaking of their necks with a stick. Poitou further testified that Race sometimes abused the victims, whether boys or girls, before wounding them and at other times after the victim had been slashed in the throat or decapitated. According to Poitou, Race disdained the victim's sexual organs, and took infinitely more pleasure in debauching himself in this manner, sodomy, than in using their natural orifice, in the normal manner. In his own confession, Gilles testified that when the said children were dead, he kissed them and those who had the most handsome limbs and heads he held up to admire them, and had their bodies cruelly cut open and took delight at the sight of their inner organs. And very often when the children were dying he sat on their stomachs and took pleasure in seeing them die and laughed. This continued for 7 years. The number of children that he killed is unknown even by Gilles himself, but is estimated to be up to 200. He would also try to summon demons to try to increase his fortune. When the summoning failed he would do it again, in a more elaborate manner. Eventually he would sacrifice children during the ritual. After he was discovered and found guilty, he was hung and set on fire. Best comment of the day. When Mozart died he owed a ton of debt, so collectors took the only thing he had tons of, and sold it off to make money. They took his paper, and sold it to fishermen to wrap fish in. This paper had music on it. Hundreds of sheets of original Mozart music was used to wrap fish, and never recorded in history.